Great. All right. Welcome, everybody, to this 13th and 14th edition of the Augmented Instruments Lab Open Seminar Series. So we're really happy today to have two special guests from two different continents to present talks around musical instruments and creativity, broadly speaking. So I'll introduce each in turn when they come up, but first we have Oliver Bown, who is a musician researcher at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where he leads the Creative Technologies Research Lab. Do I have that right? Yeah, very good. And will present around structures and trajectories of musical instruments. We'll hand it over to him to tell us what that means.
Thanks so much. And am I on? I'm on that camera there, am I?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. When I need to do my eye contact.
Yeah, right down the barrel.
Yeah. Hey. Yeah. Thanks so much for the intro, and thanks for all for coming. This is fantastic. This is the very last day of my 2.5-month stint in the UK, and I am supposed to be a visiting scholar here, but I mean, and Andrew did all of the hard work to make that happen, and life kind of got in the way a little bit for me. So yeah, so this is a big moment, and this is going to be a really what's the word? Speculative talk, like as in trying to get ideas out of my head and into other people's heads, and maybe that will produce something. And it actually began with Andrew and I have had a lot of conversations about our shared interests and ideas about collaborating. And this, I think I suggested a possible theoretical collaboration for this NIME, and of course life got in the way. And so I'm still sort of trying to throw ideas around that might stick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present, this was the proposed title I had for the paper that we were going to collaborate on. I don't know if you remember. So a theory of musical instruments, amongst which are included bells, pianos, record players, computers, trackers, DAWs, organisms, and platform generative AI. So the idea of sort of like trying to think of instruments in the expanded sense and to theorize them in meaningful ways. And the structured trajectory part is the bit that I'm going to get into, but I'm actually going to do that by way of a very old paper. So this paper is very old, as in I wrote it in 2009. It's co-authored with Alice Eldridge and John McCormack. It was the first thing I did after my PhD. I went and did a postdoc at Monash University in Melbourne, worked with those amazing people, and I'm going to talk through this paper and then sort of reflect on, it's kind of parked as a bit of theory, and then reflect on that and bring up this structured trajectory idea. So the paper basically begins by asking, it's a kind of classic NIME thought topic, whether the language of the old, we simplistically call it the old acoustic paradigm, how that's transformed by computers, basically. And so we look at three of the most common ontological points in that conceptual space: the performer, the instrument, and the score. And we devote the paper to thinking through how computers affect those things. But what we do is we do that by introducing a social frame for thinking about it, so which I'll explain as we go. So in the most simple way, an instrument is a thing we interact with. A score is also a thing, but it's informational. It's primarily about information content, and then your only agent is this thing here, the performer. Or you can have composers as well, but we're focusing on, the paper was focused on musical performance. And one of the simple things we do is we start to ask how various algorithmic systems start to move around and occupy points in between these well-known nodes. And that's because everyone knows what computers do. They break the energy-sound relationship, as we've seen theorized in various ways. They can encode information in other ways. They can enact agency. And so they can kind of, the main point is something very obvious. They can drift around in this conceptual space. And boring physical things, simple physical things can do quite complex things. So we draw in the sort of standard lineage of thinking about object agency. And here's a couple of examples of things that can do interesting things, that can behave in interesting ways. A double pendulum, one of the most simple physical objects you can imagine performing really ridiculously complex behavior. Here's something a bit more fun and stupid. You don't need to do very much to get really rich, complex behavior from a physical system which acts autonomously, at least in the sense that at this moment, nobody is performing it, enacting it, or doing anything with it. It's doing its own thing. They've configured the universe such that this performance unfolds. So, in fact, when we go back to these terms and think of all of the things that computers can do, we immediately sort of get drawn into the Noetherian or actor network theory or other theorists' kind of dilemma of how we understand theorizing agency. So if we think of a piano, and we go back to our categories performer, instrument, and score, we actually see that you can kind of problematize the classification of the piano as the instrument in multiple ways. It has score-like qualities in the sense that the keys are laid out in a certain way. If I run my fingers along the black notes, I get a melody of sorts. It has laid out information, musical information, in such a way that it can be considered to embody score-like elements. It has behavior. The strings, of course, resonate. You enact something, and then it carries on acting, admittedly in the most simple way. But also, its structure is something that isn't fixed, that we can't draw a simple boundary around. So we can creatively change the structure, as people have famously done by preparing pianos and doing other things, as my Gary Larson comical initial slide suggests. We can do very creative things with pianos. And the reconfiguration can even occur in real time. So we can reshape the structure of an instrument performatively, so it's not even clear where the object boundary is. But there are, of course, still very hard limitations. So all of these theorized issues don't really announce themselves very loudly when we're thinking about what an instrument is. Just as we can sort of play with examples of this, another example would be Aphex Twins. I use this example because it was one of the projects I was involved in, making software for that, and Aphex Twins' idea was that he could turn an orchestra into an instrument. All of the humans in the orchestra, with their amazing performative ability, are kind of conceptually reduced to kind of nodes in a synthesizer. And so again, we can creatively play with these categories. Artists can do that ad infinitum without too much trouble. Much of my work in the 2010s was, and the 2000s was devoted to thinking about this in a NIME kind of a way. So I'm going to play a tiny excerpt of a system that I spent years building called Zamutin. And my interest was in evolution as a means to make a system exhibit behavior that I wasn't really responsible for. So in a way, the double pendulum could be considered an example of a behavior that is simply latent in the universe, and I grab it and put it to use. If I sit down and write a score, then I'm kind of clearly an author of that content, and a lot of the thinking that was popular around that time around autonomous music performance systems was, in what simple ways can I extract myself from the agency of the musical work and get something else doing it? So if I write a computer program that makes music, I might manage that. Machine learning is a way that you might manage it, but of course that depends on the data it learns. Evolution was a very interesting theme in the sense that what I basically did in this project was I evolved these certain types of abstract algorithms to satisfy various complexity metrics. And I would hand code the complexity metrics, and I would hand code the evolvable system, and then I'd get the evolutionary algorithm to get the complexity metric optimized. And then I'd end up with this thing, which I kind of thought of like being an amoeba, a kind of incredibly simple agent, which had behavior that wasn't entirely of my devising, because I devised the test but not the solution to that test. Then I would kind of do a hybrid thing. I would combine the evolve system with a bunch of program stuff. So that agent would then be my kind of little generator thing, like a modular synth kind of complexity unit, and I could build a thing around it that did live music. So this is it performing with Francois Huel, a Canadian clarinetist, and this is cherry picked. This is my favorite example of the work. Let me see if this comes out. So that work, the thinking at the time was there was a lot of work in virtual musicianship, of making things that were like performers in a band and getting people to sort of, Turing test type things, getting people to perceive, asking how people perceive them, whether they believe that they were a musical agent. And I wasn't interested in any of that. I was interested in the idea of a behavior that was explicitly not trying to simulate a human, not even trying to do any of the things that, like understanding melodic content or anything. This was incredibly simple. I always referred to it as the amoeba, a sort of amoeba musician, but to create an experience of engaged musical interaction. And Francois very much responded to that. So we did several works together where he was very, I'm the researcher reporting him saying that he loved it, which is not an unbiased statement, but he was very kind of committed to the idea that there was this sort of performative richness to the thing. So we ran with that. So going back to the paper, the idea that we sort of propose is a behavioral object. So an object that's still an object, very clearly identifies an object, but it has behavior, and that behavior enacts some kind of performative agency in a performance context. Here's what we actually say in the paper. So actually, I maybe haven't set up the order of my slides as best as I could. So what I need to say first is this. As well as performative agency, so as well as thinking about what happens on stage, we very quickly came to the understanding that you really can't simply isolate this type of agency. It's all embedded together in something bigger. So in the paper we proposed mimetic agency as an alternative. So drawing on the concept of the meme, which is not language that I prefer to use, and it has gone very much out of fashion in terms of theorizing social dynamics, which I think is a good thing. Let it be reserved for silly images that get sent around the internet. Meme theory was kind of cute, but we can do better. But anyway, we use the term mimetic agency. So we wanted to develop further the idea that software introduces different types of interaction that are not covered by the acoustic paradigm. It acts as a new and distinct medium for interaction between people. Its development in creative context involves a new and distinct cycle of interaction between the developer and the software. Software elements can also interact directly with each other in musically significant ways. So you can basically build assemblages of complex interaction, which in some ways Amitin is that, because it's got the evolved part, the the programmed part. But this is kind of really drawing in the mimetic agency part of things. So think sending sound files or sending plugins to each other. So you've got instruments and scores are objects and performers are subjects, and you've got this dynamic between, this kind of distinction between performative and mimetic agency. And so to jump to the social, the stepping outside of the performance context, and I think we only do this, I'm kind of retrofitting the paper with some better references than are probably in there. I can't remember if we've got Alfred Gell in there, but Alfred Gell was an anthropologist who worked on theorizing art, social artistic behavior as an anthropological subject. And he thinks of artworks, objects, as, I'll explain how he describes them as indexes that act as a sort of agency that can move between people. And this is in the spirit of the social life of things, the social life of musical objects, instruments, recordings, and so on. So in Gell's language, people are unambiguous agents. We're primary agents, and the reasons for that are complicated, but that's a safe bet. But various other types of things in the world have an agency, but he calls them secondary agents, and he also uses this term index to describe something that there's many ways it can act, but I mean essentially it can act as a proxy for you. You can put an object out into the world, like if you write a book, your writing goes out into the world and acts as a proxy via an object, or it might act in other ways, and sometimes beyond your control. So he describes examples of artworks that were purposefully defaced or were reinterpreted as having different meaning, and that they have these kind of more complicated social lives that go beyond they don't just extend the agency of the creator. So objects can have forms of agency, and they can act as indices. Don't know why that slide's there. And so we bring in the idea of a behavioral object, something that with computational behavior intelligence, maybe forms of AI, writing in 2009, that was all very, very speculative, but that might kind of just sort of magnify the amount of agency and what kinds of things that index might be able to do. So is it a bit closer to primary agency? It's still an object. And this is a ontological confusion. And our observation in the paper is that we've for many years passed around scores amongst people. They act as agents, as indices. We pass around sound files. Sample culture captures a sort of completely new type of interaction where audio recordings are become this kind of cultural medium that isn't just about one musician imitating the style of another musician, but is actually this sort of stuff getting passed around at the speed of the internet. And then the same becomes true of software. So samples, VSTs, and then AI models and any kind of software object you can imagine becomes a thing that can pass around at such great speed that it no longer makes sense to think of instruments which take an incredibly long time to build and incredible expertise, and that someone has to then spend an incredibly long time learning to play. We enter this sort of different speed of dynamism. And then to take the sort of social idea further, when these things start to intermediate interaction, such as in recommender systems, such as in AI models that have biases that get picked up and that are used, that form cultural forms and styles, we might kind of actually sort of be on this journey towards something that has a completely radical different form. So this is where that summarizes the paper, and I'm going to try and be strict and keep to time. So the rest is just mere speculation about how I might want to revisit some of these themes. I mean, there have been themes that have been important throughout the intervening period. But this idea of sort of basically analysing things in terms of their structure, so I haven't even explained this, but the idea is like, if you think of an instrument as an object, then playing that instrument involves embarking on a trajectory through the state space of that object. So pressing the keys on a piano describes a trajectory through that structure. So if you think of the piano as a fixed structure and you think of a performance as a trajectory through the structure, that's a nice simple framing, which would be like our kind of canonical understanding of what an instrument is. And then if you try and apply that to lots of other things, cue the work that has yet to be done, you would start to realize, especially in digital instruments, that the trajectory kind of is part of the structure sometimes, especially if you kind of embed a score player in a Max MSP patch or any of these kind of, any number of NIME projects. But of course, there's a piece of software that you can bundle up and send to someone. It's an object, so it's a structure. So it's a structure that enacts its own trajectory. The performance may be something that's done to it, or it may be embedded in the structure. I want to revisit how that's done, but it strikes me that actually thinking about structure and trajectory is an almost, so is that a theoretical frame? I'm wondering if that is almost the only way we are capable of thinking about things. We are only capable of thinking about things as systems with state that then either enact behaviors or have behaviors enacted on them. So I'm taken back to Daniel Dennett's, it's a very, very sort of niche bit of writing. He talks about a distinction between how we view the world, how we model the world, and he argues that we basically have three stances that we take to all the things we interact with. Either physical, like if a tennis ball is flying through the air, I'm applying a physics view of the world, I can catch the tennis ball. A design stance, if I'm interacting with a telephone, I am trying to model what the designer's doing and understand the interface. And an intentional stance, if I'm interacting with another agent in the world, a person or an animal, I'm trying to model what they're doing and how they're behaving. And there's an argument that as systems, software systems become more complex, we're sort of pushed towards seeing things through this intentional stance. That's not actually, I don't think that's his argument, but that's sort of how we might apply that thinking. So I'm gonna basically wrap up there because I think I've already gone over time. So why have I got this piano falling on someone's head? It's to think about the fact that we can always shift the system frame that we're interested in. So we can always, for any instrument, we can think of that instrument as a socio-technical system, and the sort of social dimension to this theorizing presents that problem, that you've always got the potential to shift your what you consider the structure to a different frame. I'm gonna leave that there and take questions or hand over. Thank you. Slightly loopy, I realise.
What is the kind of thanks for the talk and for the proposed theory. What is the kind of discussion that you want to foster with your structure trajectory theory? Is it for musical instrument analysis? Is it for analysis of the aesthetics of the music that's produced with that instrument? Is it about the relationships, the professional relationships that surround that instrument? Is it a micro to macro analytical framework of understanding of everything that surrounds a certain musical artifact?
Well, I mean, the honest answer is, as I said, this is a speculative opportunity to sort of try and think through some of these things. So I certainly originally came to this with the idea that I wanted a more grounded way to theorize not just instruments, but the objects of music creation and performance, because that's what you do as a practitioner, but it's also what you do as a sociologist of musical practice. So whichever way you're coming at it, and to build on all of the sort of classic lineage of theories about objects and agency, and to try and develop that. So for me, I think the big thing is, can you integrate an object as it exists, but also as it sort of lives dynamically in a wider social frame. So you could talk about the piano as not just a fixed form, but as an evolving form over time, and to try and manage to integrate a very macro social view with a very micro performance time view. And I don't think, not convinced that's achievable. This is a attempt to
It does
do that, though.
certainly seem to be systems thinking framework for social technical systems in the musical instrument design context, sorts.
You're saying this does seem to be that?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
And it seems that it can expand to be a maximalist capture mechanism, but you'll certainly have to trace verticals or narrow slices of reality
Yeah,
to focus.
yeah.
There's a lot to think about here, thank you. To what extent do you think that either structure or trajectory, or both, is in some manner kind of constant or universal across contexts and viewpoints? Like, if you say this is the structure, does that mean that each of us in our various contexts should see the structure of that instrument similarly, and that's what makes it structure? Or is it always situational? And just using you use the example of the keyboard as an evolving form. You could also take, like, literally this piano could be a piano played by somebody in a classical or jazz context. It could be prepared a la John Cage. It could be set on fire a la Anea Lockwood. Literally not just the same kind of macro form, but actually literally the same object. So, which bit is the structure and which bit's the trajectory, and does it move around?
I mean, that's what I'm getting at with this, is that it's just an observation that I think it's unavoidable that we apply ontologies to the world, and the piano is an object, and we can talk about pianos in the abstract or specific, and there may be times when you need to speak about the specific or not. And yet there's this, I guess, paradox that we can never be sure of the frame of the thing we're talking about. So, yeah, to prepare a piano, or for, I mean, the Keith Jarrett Cone concert example of the character of that piano being this sort of quite profound agent, in that he didn't like it, but it ended up making the most successful piano record ever. You can go into, and I think that's the point, is that you can theorize pianos, and then the frame always you always have to revisit the frame, or certain contexts might demand you to revisit the frame.
Maybe what we can do is we can pass over to Tony now, and then we can have another more general discussion at the end of that. Sound okay? Good.
Great.
All right.
Thank you. I guess I'll give you that.
Oh, yeah.
Second speaker of this seminar series, we've got Tony Marasco, who is at Michigan State University working as a composer, researcher, instrument designer, leading the MSU Future Instruments Lab. So he'll tell us a bit about his work there.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Andrew. And thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me. I'm happy to be back after a really awesome NIME that was held here in London a couple months ago, or a month and a half ago. And to talk a little bit about this concept of something I've been exploring for a little over 10 years now, of creating communal and collaborative digital musical instruments with repurposed objects at the heart of them. I'll talk a little bit today about kind of my background and where I got into these two different approaches and how I started merging them together a few years ago. And I'll also talk about two projects, one from when I first started really working in this field and one that I just finished recently, and then I talked about this last year's NIME and do a little recap of that too, but both of which kind of take this broad concept in slightly different directions. So, for me, see if I can advance there. When I started with music technology, it was a very insular, solo kind of approach. Like, I think a lot of people maybe feel the same way in that your first electronic music instrument might be one that's meant for one person to play. I started with a Korg, micro Korg synthesizer, and I played in some bands and things like that where it was communal to a degree, but the actual instrument and I were working just one-on-one. And I'll always remember getting to kind of sit with my professor's synth collection, these Oberheims and Juno synths that he had collected through the 70s and 80s, and gave us a key to a small equipment closet he set up as a makeshift studio and said, go nuts, you can play with these. And I would just stay up all night learning how synthesis worked through those models, right? And so in that case, it was kind of literally and figuratively insular of an act. But the more I started working with these instruments, I started to kind of long for instruments that were electronic, that had that flexibility of synthesis, of tone color, of the way you interacted with them, but could be more communal, right? So some of the things I tended to think about and still do today is how do we actually interact with the music technology we use, and whether it's a gateway to interact with one another. If we're playing similar instruments or different instruments, are we sharing interactive elements between them by all crowding around one instrument, or are we networking them in some way so my action changes your influence or your influence changes my output in some way, shape, or form? Because I really like to see us break out of the kind of insularity of particularly what tends to happen in music technology performance. To go to the third point here, also thinking a little bit about what do we gain when music technology becomes more communal and collaborative from the start, right? If we think more about using a DAW as a performance tool versus I'm going to use this as my toolkit to make a piece of music and I'm the only one composing this, I create a piece of music with it, and it's my insular vision. What could we do if we're using tools like Ableton and Ableton Link, or we're using networked musical performance techniques and performing web instruments where my turn of a dial can change something on your instrument, as if we were crowded around one massive piano all kind of playing within the sound box. So my kind of longing for wanting to make music of that technique when I started kind of in the DMI scene back in like 2015 or so, was also coupled with the things I was doing on my own. When I first started getting into electronic design, my route into that was by taking things apart and by getting copies of things like Make Magazine and saying like, okay, how does a radio work? And finding an old radio at a thrift store and breaking it open and then trying to figure out what the circuit board did and why these parts worked the way they worked, right? That led me into something we'll talk about a little bit here in a moment, known as like circuit bending or hardware hacking, which was my avenue into building my own circuits and digital music instruments from scratch. And that speaks to this broader context that's been talked about quite a lot in the last few years, particularly in the DMI community, of repurposing and reusing or focusing on revitalizing instruments instead of always focusing on new, recreate the wheel or make something novel, right? There's a fantastic paper in the NIME archives from I think 2023 by Raul Masso called The O in NIME, which he and his team emphasized the old, right? If we think of that new interfaces for musical expression, this paper does a really cool walkthrough of the NIME archives and kind of has all these stats on how many projects focus on something brand new, never done before, But the ramifications of that tend to be that those projects have short lifespans. When you think of a broader global context, we're using a bunch of computer resources that are then maybe going to be thrown away or not properly recycled, depending on where you live, if that's even a possibility with your local communities to recycle electronics responsibly. And so what they argue is that if we focus on older technology, like taking a DMI you made 10 years ago and continuously revitalizing it, or building new DMIs that feature old hardware, you can kind of have this approach where you can still hit the novel and the new can still be a part of this, but it doesn't have to be the main focus of it. And you can also practice good sustainability and longevity as well. So in my own process, or practice I should say, with this process, starting with making things out of old objects by circuit bending devices, I see this as a way to practice media archaeology. Right, this idea of saying, okay, here's a device like a radio, here's a device like a CD player. What was this for, right? What was this used for? Why were people using it? Why does it do what it does? What are its limitations and its benefits? And what did that mean for people using it at that time? And saying, if I use this as a new instrument, then how does that history come with it as well, right? Also kind of trying to find a balance that whenever I'm making something new or focusing on newness in my DMIs, can there be a balance of oldness and repurposed and recontextualized aspects too, right? So that it's not all something completely from scratch, but maybe uses some things that we have lying around or we might be familiar with, right? Oftentimes that means using things known as ready-mades, right? That was a term often used by artist Marcel Duchamp, talking about things that were mass-produced, manufactured, that you could buy off the shelf and saying, okay, this is already produced. Can I take this and modify it and use this as the basis of my artwork instead of sculpting something completely from scratch, let's say from a block of clay, right? And also, by doing this, can we find a way to make our DMIs focus on things that are sociological research? What does it mean to use an object that many people have probably already seen before, but you're now asking them to use it in a slightly different way or a completely different way? And what kind of potential comes from that when our DMIs are not completely something nobody's ever seen before, but play with that balance of familiar and completely outside the box? That led me to kind of do a little research on other theories with this. And this past year, when I was working on this project that we'll talk about in a moment, I kind of discovered this reading by Madeline Akrich called The Descripting of Technical Objects. It's a really fantastic paper, and there's been a lot of people who have used this in the NIME and DMI field as well. This paper talks quite a lot about how most objects, particularly like ready-mades, if we think of that as an example, do carry these structural scripts that we embed in them, right? So if you pick up an object that is a familiar or historical object, it's got a lot of roles assigned to it, maybe because of where you've seen it used, how you've used it in the past, how societies writ large have used these objects in the past, and that like an actor or actress in a film, the scripts are kind of built into the tool, right? You kind of have come to it with some kind of preconceived understanding. If we try and change that, this act of descripting it, by saying like, yes, this is a can opener, but could it also be something else? Could it also be a percussion instrument? Could we twist it around and now it's also used for making your own homemade currency or something like that, right? Like, can you descript this object or play with the balance of the inherent scripts and the new rewritten scripts that you're putting into it as well? And when we think about that, from the circuit bending or building objects using repurposed musical tools, how does the media archaeology, the entirely new sonic narrative you give to the device, play into this as well? By no means is this like a new thing in the NIME field. It's been pretty prominent in the last decade or so. And the works that really inspired me to pursue this, when I kind of took my background in circuit bending, hardware hacking, and wanting to make things that were collaborative and shared and communal, are some of the ones I listed here. So the first piece I ever saw that really made it clear to me that this was something that was where my interests overlapped was this piece by Peter Busigal, Stephen Moore, and Scott Smallwood called Chorus for Untrained Operator. It was written in 2016. And the way that this piece works is in the art gallery, I'll show you some pictures here, if I can wrangle that tab. There we go. In the art gallery where this is held, you've got all these different ready-made objects like tape cassette players and record players and blenders and kind of like alarm bells, all wired up and kind of suspended or placed on platforms throughout the room. And then in the center, you have this old 1940s telephone switchboard operation console with a bunch of jacks and a lot of like pulled out cables. And you're not really given much of a prompt of what to do in this space, but when you do take these cables and make connections on the switchboard, you'll get certain objects to kind of like come to life. Like this record player behind you will start up and start playing, and then if you break that connection and make a different one, you'll hear this blender hanging from the ceiling start going as well. And what I think is so fun about this piece is that you could interact with it on your own, but it really comes to life when you start working on this in a group. And I remember the first time using or interacting with this piece when we had about a group of us, just trying to see what connections did what, and can we remember those. They even provide you with some blank score sheets here. So like a modular synth kind of diagram, you can say this connection does this does this. And we would try and come up with like a rhythm-based piece, all of us working together, because one person couldn't patch all these in tandem or in rhythm at the same time, right? So to me, this was a way to kind of take these ready-made objects that weren't modified too heavily, but to have you be able to control an entire orchestra of these things and turn them into musical objects if you wanted to think about them in the way of like these are instruments in an ensemble and they can overlap with each other. And then the other piece that I found really intriguing on this same theme is a piece by Jocelyn Ho and Meg Shadell and Matthew Blessing. It's kind of a series of pieces called Women's Labor. And this is kind of an investigation into how domestic objects like irons and ironing boards or rheostat controlled like drying racks can be converted into instruments. So the project here has kind of resulted in a number of different pieces, like this one here called Ring Down, where the team built these 3D printed irons that look like old early 19th century steam irons. And so through the performance of actually laying clothes on a wooden ironing board and moving the iron back and forth, right, the internal electronics, which are some like accelerometers and gyroscopes, will drive synthesis through the act of actually doing the laundry, right? And it is a really fascinating commentary on domestic labor, on how these actions were seen as vital but were under-supported and underappreciated, and now they are on stage as a performance act. And I think it's also a really interesting way to say, instead of taking an existing steam iron, printing one from PLA, and building it so you can fit all your custom controllers in it, but can you make it look as close as possible to the original thing, is another workaround here too, that if you can find a way to kind of show the script and the fact that you're descripting these objects, as long as it looks like an iron and people see that connection, you can get as close to that phenomena as possible, even if you can't, or maybe impractical to take an existing iron from this time period and try and modify it from the ground up. So that led me, as I get my mouse back over here, back in 2019 to pursue this project called Bend.io. And I also wrote a number of pieces using this system, and we'll give a listen to one such piece called The Spinning Earth Shall Spread Before You in just a moment here. But essentially, like I talked about earlier, this idea of hardware hacking, of taking a pre-existing object like a Speak and Spell and a Guitar Hero controller and merging them together into one so you can get this electronic device that you have an understanding of how it works to sound different from what you expect it to, was a place that I started with as an electronic musician. And so what I wanted to do was extend the circuit bending practice by making it so that instead of one person holding this bent instrument that had physical, tangible controls, instead you could go ahead and put a mediation system in between the performer and the bent or modified object. And I'll skip past that example here. And you can network these devices. So you could have a circuit bent Furby talk to your circuit bent speak and spell, right? Or you could have one person control a whole orchestra of circuit bent devices. But unlike the patch bay at the heart of Chorus for untrained operator, if this was all web enabled, you could have this controlled with a social media post. You could have people from across the world control these devices. And you can have this communal aspect to circuit bending, which does not happen that often because you're often going to need to be around a particular device to do it. So that led to the building of this Bend.io system, which was a set of web-enabled software and like a node-based controller and a physical hardware board that had an ESP32 microcontroller, some read relays to emulate buttons and momentary or toggle switches, digital potentiometer, a DC motor driver. So basically trying to cram as many different things I could think of that you might want to make spin or click or change resistance levels onto one board. And then you can connect this board to a circuit bent device the same way you would a physical switch or dial, but instead just wiring it to these headers here. So when you were done, you can disconnect it and port it over to another circuit bent device as well. I'll play a short example here of a piece I wrote with this system for two circuit bent CD players. So what I did was take two CD players, hack them in the same manner, and both of them are networked together so that I've got one person performing them through a web interface. Actually, this performance is from a couple years ago where I was performing one of these CD players and my friend in Wisconsin was performing it while the CD players were in Texas. So together we kind of set up like a live stream performance and we can kind of play each person's CD player from afar. So with that piece, both CD players have the same CD of original material that I burned onto both, just a series of different arpeggios and some drum machine patterns. But because we can pause them and we can fast forward and we can let each other's loop at different lengths, you can get these really interesting combinations of synchronization, unsynchronization. This is a diagram that shows kind of the networking topology of this here, where you can either have one person play both CD players, or what we did in that example, have each of us assigned to a single CD player. But because of the Bend.io network running in the background, the CD players could also send messages to each other. We're all just clients on the same server. And so at certain points in the performance, I would ask my CD player to pause, and it would actually sort of have a gate saying, no, I'm not going to listen to your commands for a little bit. And so it would kind of lock me out purposely for a bit. So it taught me as an improviser and my friend Nick to kind of think on the fly. And then we might have one CD player actually say, I want the other one to pause, or I want it to fast forward for a bit if it is paused. So it gives us a way to kind of work within the network with the machine and human interaction in a kind of interesting way. Yeah. And so to me, that was a way where we could take one circuit bent device, and if we could duplicate it, we could have many people play them together. Or if we only had one device, we could have thousands of people play it through some kind of mediated software and network and make it more collaborative than it would be if it was tangible controls. And so to show you kind of different ends of the spectrum, to fast forward 10 years or a little less, I want to talk a little bit about this recent project that I undertook with my friend Alexis Bacon and Sandros Barros called Host Your Ghosts. So last year, we were asked to participate in a community art show held at the Turner Dodge Museum. This is a historical mansion in Lansing, Michigan. And it's a really interesting spot because it's a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's a historical site. It's one of the oldest places in Lansing. It's also very spooky looking and very eerie when it's not decorated for like our communal concert events and things like that. And our friend David McCarthy runs a community-focused concert series as a way to get more people to see concerts that aren't just happening at the big universities like MSU and University of Michigan down the street. So he wanted us to set up a Halloween-focused art show that would have different installations that would think about the occult in a slightly different manner. So instead of saying this is going to be, a traditional haunted house of people in makeup and like zombie costumes, could we take this concept of frights and scares and things that bother people and think about them in ways that are a little more serious? So if we took a phrase like what haunts you, you could answer that phrase in a lot of different ways, right? You could say it's spiders, or it's spirits, or I really hate spooky movies because they scarred me as a kid when I saw them too early. But it could also be things like climate change and political strife and fear of impending financial collapse and things like that, right? So what we did for our contribution to this was take an object that we thought had a lot of different scripts embedded in it, like a Ouija board. And what we looked at in our historical analysis here is this Ouija board, very popular in mid-20th century pop culture through films like The Exorcist and YA books and things through the 80s and 90s, but has this legacy that goes all the way back to the post-Civil War era in America, when a lot of people were really interested in communing with the dead as they lost loved ones in the Civil War and then upcoming strifes and plagues in the future, right? So this tool that can be looked at as both a medium for communicating with lost loved ones, also eventually marketed as a board game, right, by the Parker Brothers and Hasbro Company today. We wanted to take this act of using a Ouija board and say, can we acknowledge the things that people come to it with their preconceived notions of it, and also add our own aspects into it as a tool for communal performance. And so what we did with our installation, Host Your Ghosts, was we built these two stages of the piece around the Ouija board use. One that's more of a communal group experience and one that's a solo experience. Then both of them are decoupled. So you could either participate in both of these and not know that they are connected or interrelated in any way, shape, or form. Or you can participate in just one, but your contributions would still create the overall sonic tapestry of the work. So we've got this one phase known as the statement phase, and this is when, on your own, we ask people to come into a little recording booth and to record a spoken statement answering the prompt of what haunts you. And again, they can respond in any way, shape, or form they want to, and then we use those recordings as our corpus for some of the sonic generation we'll talk about a bit later. In a separate space, we have what we call the divination phase. So this is when people actually come together as a group and place their hands on the planchette and move it across the Ouija board to cull some sound back from a multi-channel sound system. And so because these are in different spaces, we encourage people to go try out both spaces if they'd like to, but we don't actually tell them that the recordings from this space are used in this space and vice versa. To give you an idea of kind of the networking behind this, in the recording booth, we've just got a simple max patch that we built with some duckers and some noise gates so we can kind of remove as much background noise from the recordings as possible. And then we upload those recordings remotely to a server that we then grab over in the next room. So we grab those recordings, and what we do is we use Flucoma and some machine learning analysis to do some analysis on the concatenated file of all the recordings, and we try and figure out, based on brightness, based on timbre, we use that to build a single corpus, and then we go and reanalyze that same source 3 more times to build a series of 4 slightly different corpora from the same recordings. And as the concert goes on, or let's say the installation is running for a few hours, every now and then we will add new, or we'll reanalyze. So we'll add the new recordings captured into the corpora as the piece happens. And so to give you an example here, this is both the Ouija board movement, and then we've got the software capture from our max patch, which is running our analysis algorithm here. And what we're doing is we're using this custom-made planchette interface, which I brought one with me and we can pass it around later if you'd like. When we were thinking about how we'd get people to take their interactions with the Ouija board and turn it into a performance interface, we went through a lot of different prototypes of using like a camera tracking system or some kind of series of magnetometers underneath the Ouija board to kind of track the movement. But we were afraid that any kind of visual modification to the board itself would kind of ruin the illusion of this is an off-the-shelf, traditionally bought Ouija board you may have had in your own home growing up. And so what we did was put all of the modifications and electronics into a custom planchette, which uses optical odometry tracking to tell where it's moving across the board in X and Y space. And then we use that to connect through the different 2D soundscapes or spaces, let's say, of the corpora. So as we move left and right, it actually selects different samples from each corpus and then spatializes them through the sound system. And to give you an example of some of the electronics here, this is what the planchette looks like. It's 3D printed with PLA, and I designed a custom carrier board with an ESP32 microcontroller and this optical odometry tracker that also has an IMU built in. So we can use things like the rotation of the planchette. We can also use things like the acceleration, the jostle, and the speed of the planchette to change different things with the effects chains as we go. And with communication, we can either do a wired communication through serial, or we can use Collab Hub, which is a system I co-developed for client-server kind of networked communication to stream over in an OSC-esque protocol remotely. So we also have like a built-in LiPo battery into each planchette, so we don't have to have the cable there as well. And to wrap up here, to show you a little bit about how we mapped the motion of the planchette. The X and Y positions are the most important ones. We're using that to choose samples from the corpus and to spatialize where those samples come out of in the spatialized sound system. And then we're also using things like the heading of the planchette as it tilts across the Y-axis to change things like our resonator effect that we have to kind of mask some of the phrases in the playback, whatever's happening at that moment. And then we also found that in our first performances of this, that a lot of people would try and move the planchette really quickly in kind of jerky motions to see if that caused any change. And we said, well, we should see if we can find a way to do that. And so we have these different sets of presets for the effects that get changed as people move slowly or if they move it really quickly and get a really big spike in velocity and acceleration as well. So that way it's encouraging for folks who want to treat it a little more like an instrument and try and move it around quickly, and for the folks who treat it a little bit more like a typical Ouija conjuring experience, which typically has very slow, gradual movement across the board. We wanted to have both versions of this experience work well for folks. So yeah, those are two projects that I've explored along this process. If you have any questions for me, I'd love to answer them. And I've got links to 2 papers here that talk about both the projects if you like to read more. And I've also got my contact information there as well. But thank you so much for joining me today for this talk. Yes.
Speaking to the top. Yes, the top bit. Is that the top? Yeah, very interesting.
Thank
With the Ouija board,
Yeah.
so the thing about Ouija boards, as you know, it's about idiomotor action. It's the
Right.
plausible denial. I didn't touch it. I didn't touch it
Yes,
either. But
yeah.
actually, everybody's touching a little bit. And so you were talking about collaboration and collaborative instruments. And I wondered whether you were able to play with that in your design at all. And also whether you were, because the other big thing about Ouija board is the idea of you ask it something, you spell something out. So were you actually working with the sort of everybody's script of what a Ouija board does?
Yeah.
And also were you able to be playful with the idea of plausible denial that anybody moved it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have done this project about 3 times now. And the first time we did it, we tried it being a little more guided of an experience. So we would ask the participants, like, would you like to ask a question like you would with a traditional Ouija board use, and then see as a group if you can see things spelled out. But what we found just kind of through casual observations was that some people did focus on that like visual aspect of the planchette as pointing out certain letters, and then sounds are playing back, and they kind of were trying to see was there a connection between the words pulled from the recordings captured to match what they were spelling. And some people would not look at all. They would move around and just wait till they heard a sound and then say, oh, I'm gonna just keep kind of exploring and see what sounds I hear, and could I build a phrase from these syllables or from these words? And the prompt of sort of like, would you wanna ask a question? Would you wanna do, build some communication with the spirits? Didn't seem to really resonate with them. So what we've moved to now as a way to kind of find a middle ground is when people sit down at the Ouija board, we give them a written statement that asks them to internally ask themselves the same question that the people recording themselves in the other room ask themselves: what haunts you? And so instead of speaking it out loud, they can speak it in their head or kind of imagine it internally. And then as people just start kind of moving around, our hope is that as they hear certain words or as they see if they want to focus on letters that are coming through by the movement, is there a connection between what they thought and then what people have also been thinking in this kind of time displaced aspect? So for instance, when we did this at NIME a month and a half ago, there was a lot of people in the recording booth who mentioned things like the heat was haunting them, or the fact that big data could scrape their social media feed. And afterwards, when we chatted with some folks, some people mentioned that they had been thinking about certain things about like internet privacy, and they heard aspects like Wi-Fi, or they heard like Facebook or things. So some folks, I think, were trying to make a connection between what they mentally imagined scared them and what other people had mentioned in their recordings. And that, I think, for us was our middle ground that we've explored so far, of asking people to mentally internalize it, which has that kind of meditative approach of using the Ouija board, but not necessarily go through the same instructions that might be with a Ouija board that they would see when they open the box.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Oh, sorry, the right way around.
Yeah.
Because so idiomotor action, or I think that's what it's called, is so interesting. If you're thinking about collaborative instruments, what happens if you strip all the hocus pocus away and just say, what happens if we make a collaborative instrument where all the interesting effects are using that idiomotor thing?
Yeah.
And I just wondered whether you'd explored that, because it's sort of underexplored, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like the opposite of what we all try to do, is make it obvious. It's like make it really sly.
Yeah, and we did observe some folks kind of wondering like how to get started, right? Like putting their hands on the planchette and then kind of waiting to see who would move first. So yeah, I think there's a room for us to explore this even more, to say, remove all the kind of other constructs around Ouija board use and just see like how long does it take for somebody to make that first physical motion that triggers somebody else to say, oh, we're moving it now, or we're starting, and the performance is starting, and I'm going to move in tandem, or I'm going to move against them in some way. Yeah, yeah. I think a balance of pulling those things apart would be really interesting.
Because it goes further than that. It's not just going, oh, we're moving it and now let's all move. It's the fact that you are genuinely under the impression that nobody's moving it.
Right.
But that's, I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah.
And do you have to, I don't necessarily have to call to anything supernatural to feel that. It's a very odd feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I don't think you do. And I think this idea of whether it's a drum or a string instrument like a harp or this game, that is a really cool aspect to explore, right? Like, how do we find a way to not know who's causing it, but the collective is causing it? Yeah.
Really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's great.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Great,
thanks, Ollie.
great talk. I'm trying to see if I can improvise some connections. And
Yeah, please.
So the Ackridge paper is great, and I feel like I've got a lot out of that way of thinking. If I remember rightly, and it is a bit of a rusty memory, I don't know if you'll recall, but in the paper there's a ethnographic study of the deployment. I think it's of like photo.
Yes, it's like
It's,
photoelectron.
Yeah, lighting in
Yes.
Africa, right? So
Yes.
I haven't muddled the papers up.
Yeah, no.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, to go into that example, which of course so many of these papers introduce a massive idea and then sort of apply it in a very specific context, and it's quite hard to fathom exactly how the idea sort of spills out into
How it could be broader.
other contexts. Now, you're talking about ready-mades, and she's talking about something which is, I guess, it's kind of a ready-made. It's this. So if people don't know the paper, it's basically like, it's a solar panel plus battery plus light, right?
Right. Yes, I think
So
so.
you
yeah.
can have solar-powered lighting, courtesy of a battery storing the energy, and it's supposed to be deployed into African villages or something. So it's a solution to the problem of lighting.
Yeah.
And part of the analysis was showing that like the cables were too short, so you couldn't put the solar panel in the window and have the light where you wanted the light. And
Right.
and it was a custom cable design,
Yeah.
custom socket, and so no one could hack it. I'm thinking of ready-mades, and I'm thinking the thing about ready-mades is that they're already successful. Like they've already done the job of iterated design, whereby the bad designs have fallen away and the good designs have survived.
Yeah.
And this is where I'm trying to make a
Yeah, for sure,
vague link
yeah.
to what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And so how does that affect the idea of inscription? It's not just the inscription of a designer, it's actually something that's been put to the test through iterated use.
Yeah.
And then, so that's kind of one question, is
Yeah,
like,
sure.
is a ready-made evidence that maybe the inscription by the designer is not quite the whole story?
Yeah.
And secondly, when you're making musical instruments, you're obviously completely breaking that chain of
Yes.
of connection to the inscribed purposes. And I guess, how do you actually try and really carry across the inscribed? Well, I mean, on the one hand, you're descripting.
Yes. Yeah.
But I feel like there's more to it than that, that you also want to sort of carry the story of the inscription through.
Yeah. So for the first question you bring up, to me, I think, yeah, maybe it's more of an act of looking at the inscription process, not from the designer's point of view, but from the user's point of view, or where this thing lives in the shared history or like pop culture of the object, right? So if you give somebody a CD player who's used one, right, like it invokes a number of different things that has a lot of historical connection, or where they had one that was similar, or maybe where that represented a big leap forward for them in consuming media and the like. But from the design point of view, yeah, you're right. By the time it got to the shelf, the designer had already went through these different iterations of saying, this is not going to work, right? So the act of designing it is their successful inscription, right, perhaps, but then the way it lived on for years and years after would be the way we use it, to, as like the zeitgeist. So to me, I think I'm more interested in that secondary part. The fact that if we do approach a CD player and you're asked to engage with it, or in the case of the Ouija board, you're asked to engage with it, what is your personal story with that object? And have you ever seen one before? Have you ever used one? Have you seen it tangentially, where maybe in a movie it's been kind of sold to you as an occult object that shouldn't be touched or used, and that's the only time you've interacted with it? Or do you have a completely different approach to it? Have you actually used one in a sense where you'd say, well, this is more of a spiritual object and all the other pop culture is kind of looking down on it, and maybe even our installation. Again, we try and strike a balance between the seriousness of the communal aspect of it and, you know, the pop culture spookiness, for lack of a term. So, yeah, I think on those two categories, I'd say I'm thinking of this more as the inscription and description of the user side after the object's already made versus the designer side, like she's talking about in that paper. Yeah. And then to the second one, can you remind me of the second?
Well, I think you answered it.
Oh, yes. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, you did. All at once.
Yeah, oh great, okay, yeah, yes, successful. But yeah, I think that those are the things that interest me the most, in that there are these spoken or unspoken understandings of certain objects, and if you get to interact with them as a musical sense, can you tie your ability to perform, or can it open you up to performing in a way that maybe a cello can't? Because for some people, maybe the user inscribed script of a cello is, this takes some skill. This takes some physical attributes that maybe I don't have enough years under my belt of learning how to hold it properly or tighten the strings or move the bow properly. So I might not approach that instrument. That's where I think your research has a lot of really interesting aspects of, like, what about the instrument itself tells you how to use it or how to engage with it. And oftentimes I think we look at things like laptops because, well, if you learn the software, then the laptop you probably know how to use from other contexts of your experience. So it's interesting when you remove that physical structure and say, how would you engage with this? If it's a board game, maybe there's a little less of a barrier there because you've used it before. Now you're asked to use it for just a different context.
Sorry,
Yeah, no worries, yeah.
No, that's really interesting.
Yeah, cool, thanks, Ollie. Yeah.
I won't slide it along the table.
It'll make a great noise. Yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, just to say, if anyone's watching online, you can drop a question into the live chat, and we'll keep an eye on that. But yeah, really interesting talk. Thanks.
Thanks.
And I wanted to maybe then go back to the Bendit IO board.
Yeah, yeah.
And think about, I guess, like, I guess it's sort of a question of protocol, but it's a question of meaning, really. Like, you know, essentially, you have these circuit bent objects where the whole idea is that you approach it kind of with a willful disregard to what it was originally supposed to do and what you are and are not supposed to do with it. And everyone comes up with these very idiosyncratic modifications, you know, just very phenomenological, like, oh, when I do this, it makes this amazing thing, so now I'm going to, you know, put a switch on it so that I can get that sound again. It seems like with the Bendit interface, you're trying to, in some manner, formalize that idiosyncrasy by way of saying, well, this is going to be the kind of language of remote circuit bending. These are going to be the kind of interventions that are and are not possible, and this is the way we're going to control them or not control them. And so there's a kind of sense, there's a way in which I guess you are inscripting that object itself, right? You know, you're kind of imagining a use situation. And I wonder if you can talk about how you came to decide sort of what it should and shouldn't do, and how to kind of balance off between attempting to make something that was in some manner sensible to anybody using it, while also kind of staying true to the sort of freewheeling spirit of circuit bending, where kind of if you find a convention, you'll find somebody who breaks it.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. I think to answer the second part first, what I was kind of aiming at with Bendit was that it would be a system where you could come to it after you did that initial exploration that you mentioned that makes circuit bending kind of the crux or the artistic practice that it is, right? Like you're breaking something open, poking around, saying, this is really cool. I want this to have a constant presence in my instrument, so it's just a cable-to-cable connection, or I want to break and make that connection, or this is a great effect, so I want to adjust the intensity, like with a potentiometer. And after you've done that stage, that's where I felt when designing Bendit that you could include this intermediary system to say, okay, you know what you'd like the instrument to do, or you've explored and discovered what it can do. Now you can think a little bit more about how you get it to do those things. And if it is a direct one-to-one connection, this button equals this sonic phenomena, can we use Bendit in the software side of its system as a mediating system to say, well, now it can be N-to-one, right? Or it can be one-to-one transformed and modified. Like thinking about, Ollie, your presentation, like if you have these agents that are intelligent agents, can it change the way that each person interacts with each other? Because maybe the message from person A to B gets modified and changed because it has to go through that tunnel, so to say, of like a smart agent. So to me, that's where I felt that we can change the kind of potential in scripting, right? Could we have a device that you've explored through the more tactile solo exploration, and instead of having this same, well, you do have a same physical switch that would open and close, or a same channel, let's say, on the digital potentiometer that you would need to route that data to, because these cables always connect to these 2 points and they change that. So it wouldn't be like free breadboarding or like free hacking the circuit bed object on the fly. But you could say, okay, if this is the fixed setup where the board actually connects to the Furby, then all the space in between what I do to actually get that action to happen could be flexible and fluid and changeable. Yeah, that was my approach to it, as saying that there are going to be some fixed parts, but could we kind of extend that outward? Does that answer some of it, or is there some
Yeah,
parts?
absolutely. I think it does. And maybe it's just because of the Furby example, but I can't help but think of Look Mum No Computers
Yes,
Museum, which is a fascinating place.
Yeah.
To me, one of the interesting things about exploring that space is not just the objects themselves, which have been alternately preserved and kind of modified in various ways, but also the kind of logic of interactivity that is presented in the museum, which actually I think has a certain thing in common with what you're doing with Bendit, in terms of the idea that what renders things playable is the ability to switch them on and off.
Yeah.
There I think it often takes the form very explicitly of a keyboard. You have a keyboard, and then various Furbies do their thing or whatever. And here maybe it's slightly different, but there is this notion that what makes it musical is a certain kind of volitional control.
Yeah.
And that the technology is aimed around that kind of volitional control. Do this thing on this web interface, and now the thing will respond. And from that, then it's what makes it sensible, so that people can make music out of it. I don't know if that's fair or not. I don't know if that's.
No, I think that is, and I do. When thinking about this, there's definitely that. I don't want to say danger, because it's not really a danger, but there is a issue to think about where if you make the mediation too intensive, or you give too much agency, let's say, to the mediation and not enough to the people who engage with the mediating system, it does become really difficult to know, is what I'm doing actually making any change? Or can I tell that when I do this, I get this change? So I'm going to do it every 2 beats, or I'm going to try and do it every now and then. That is definitely something when I was kind of sketching out the Spinning Earth piece with the 2 CD players that I was really cautious about. Like if we gave the CD players too much agency to ignore the commands coming from the web interface, then it would be really challenging to know, oh boy, I don't know if I'm actually making this change or not. And so when you're improvising with it, it's kind of hard to tell if your action results in a reaction at all. And also, I think helping in the CD player piece in particular, the sonic material was also important in how you chose it too. I really aimed for very simple, for the lack of a better term, kind of basic musical structures like arpeggios, drum loop patterns that didn't have a lot of inherent processing on them or effects, so that any kind of change or modification sonically that would be really jarring and noticeable, it could be clear that this is because you did something with the CD player. Some kind of internal connection through the Bendit board has caused the CD player to ring mod this or garble it when it's reading from the anti-skip memory buffer, and to tell, okay, this is not something that I did in Ableton and burned to the CD. This is something you did as the performer, because the CD player responded.
Yeah. Maybe I could ping that back over to Ollie then.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could say anything about just I don't know, the kind of primary and secondary agencies that might be involved in a situation like this. And then, I mean, because here, what Tony, I think you're talking about is trying to make the agency really transparently kind of adherent to one or another of the performers and saying, I do this, therefore this thing happens,
Yes,
and it's all very transparent. But of course, one of the things when you end up with more autonomous systems in the middle is that does become a bit more opaque, but that's maybe part of the point. So I don't know, I mean, if you could just use that as a riffing point.
Well,
Everyone is woken up on the live
sorry,
stream.
sorry, listeners.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, the piece I played, I mean, I'm sure everyone in the room's had some dabbling with, systems that you don't know quite what's happening, and you didn't know what was happening, and I explained, but I didn't really show. And I mean, in that piece, there are these, again, it's a cherry-picked piece as well, like, there are these beautiful there are these beautiful rhythmic moments where everything sort of like the system has no metronome in it, so the fact that it's sort of doing things on the beat and stuff is all part of the magic of how Francois is sort of making it work.
Yeah.
And there's at least some level of illusion in terms of what it's doing. And of course, by interacting, you learn what it does and doesn't do and its behaviour.
Yeah.
I guess that's one part of the answer, but I guess just to sort of riff on your question, you're working with ready-mades. There's these millions of inscriptions in CD players. And so it's a nice example of the agency being so diffuse in terms of the thing. And then actually you're kind of almost working against all of the complexity of the behavior by boiling it down to these very simple interface.
Yes. Yeah.
And I really like what you're saying about that choice of music, which is, I mean, you could have just done sine waves, I suppose, or white noise or something like that really communicated that property. But you go somewhere in between. You bring this kind of, actually there's a scored element, there's a pre-composed element in it.
I was really inspired with this piece by Nicholas Collins. Did a work for string quartet and a hacked CD player. He wrote this in 1989, I think, and the album was called Broken Light. It came out in 91. And the CD player is playing a CD of Corelli string octets. So in that piece, what I love about it is that he asks the string players to emulate the things coming out of the hacked CD player. So when you kind of like hold the fast forward button down, you get this kind of like zipping of the laser reading erratically across the disc from track to track. He then asked the string players to emulate that with their bows. When it's paused and it's creating that kind of rhythmic claves like I did in mine, he asked the string players in a Steve Reich-esque way to kind of do these kind of rhythmic patterns. So for that piece, I feel like he's trying to merge those two worlds and make it seem like they're the same, or it's hard to tell from a recording what is what. For me, I wanted it to be really clear what was the non-bent part and what was the bent part, and draw a distinction. Yeah, because the concern might be, well, can you tell what the CD player is doing to this stuff if it sounds the same when it's bent and not bent? So I think that's an interesting road to travel down, for sure.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you both. I guess I'm interested in, I'm going to try to ask this question and ask both of you a question at the same time, but thinking about it from like a designer perspective and thinking about, say, these inscriptions, and then I think you used like the landscape of the structure and trajectories that create these kind of like etches or grooves, was the way I was sort of thinking about it. How do we as designers, or how did you respond to those, say, in the making, like the choosing of using flacoma and timbre analysis and the machine learning algorithms? Like, did the fact that you used a Ouija board influence that at all? And did that influence the people? And I guess then Ollie, in your, I guess, like the theorization, and do you see this as being a way for designers to look at this landscape in a different way and make different decisions, or choose to work with these inscriptions in a different way?
I guess I could start, we're passing the mic to Ollie, but particularly with the Ouija board piece with Host Your Ghosts, I think, and connected to what Ollie talked with us about today, this idea of some kind of agent in the middle was really interesting to us to dive into this concept of like communicating with an unseen force, right? Or a series or group of unseen forces. So we knew pretty early on that we wanted people to contribute sonically through recording, and we knew that we wanted people to have the act of moving the Ouija board to bring up those recordings, right? But the idea of using machine learning and Flucoma to us was a way to say, okay, we can have an agent that we have some control over, like we can adjust the descriptors, we can adjust the sensitivity and how many features are being looked at, but because we can't control who is speaking into the mic and what they're saying and what we're recording, it gives us a sense of non-control in what Flucoma is going to give us, right? Every time we run that analysis, because we don't know who's gone and said what into the mic, we're going to find some things in those corpora that are really interesting and really out there. The first time we did this, we had somebody going through the house, where the Turner Dodge house, with a puppet, kind of like an old school marionette kind of Punch and Judy puppet. And he must have walked into the recording booth at one time and had the puppet record a phrase, and he had the puppet just screaming into the microphone, and that became part of the tapestry sonically for the next 2 hours until we had enough recordings to kind of almost like minimize it in some way. And so that's something that I think we felt with the machine learning process. Every time we would reanalyze it, we would get some parts of that scream, we would get some words from that, and it was kind of, we're leaving that agency out of it in the same way that if somebody were to use the Ouija board and say, ask it a question, and you have all these people with the ideomotor response, and it's moving together as this really cool collective physical phenomenon, there's only so much you can do to steer that. So from the designer's perspective, that's why we landed on that kind of machine learning approach to say, how do we reconcile these two things and still continue the theme, I guess, broadly saying.
I'm not sure if I'm going to segue smoothly. I mean, the touch point for me, I think, to think about the response to your question is like, I mean, if you think of sample culture emerging as a practice, and then people designing instruments that work with sample culture, there's a kind of fairly obvious progression of recorded media being used for listening to music and then becoming a tool, and then the sampler and the sampling keyboard and all of those things kind of emerging. So when it comes to I think I'm answering your question, like when it comes to designers thinking about how they engage with these themes, I mean, I see that like if you think of Miller Pocket making Maximus P as like an act of creation, it's creating this meta platform that allows anyone to bring in their own plugins, and also for people, I mean, plugins, objects, behaviors, and for people to rapidly share those around. And that was really at the core of that 2009 paper's suggestion that software, like of exactly how socially transformative software is in terms of transforming practice. And then to maybe think about where we're about to go on the journey with machine learning, not just as a tool that is like a trained network that you can do something with, but as a thing that has these multiple points of interaction, training your own network, copying someone else's network code, sending a trained network to someone else, embedding a trained network into your Ableton Live set. All of these touch points are now a design frontier, and someone's going to design like some next paradigm that we bring that into practice with. So again, I've got no idea if I just went way off topic with what you were pointing to there. But I guess to wrap that up, there's the co-evolution between practice and design is sort of where that is worth looking at. And I think there's so much more time to bring in thinking like Ackridge and those sort of sociological frameworks for understanding design.
Yeah. Should we wrap it there? Conclude?
All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Big round of applause.